Good morning. This morning we're going to talk through Chapter 2. I've named it Escaping the Black Hole of Calcutta Unscathed because Chapter 2 is usually the biggest obstacle people face when they're developing their perspective or their proposal. So in developing your proposal, Chapter 2 serves several functions, but involves researching potentially hundreds of articles. And as a result, people can get lost. So welcome to Escaping the Black Hole of Calcutta Unscathed. I'm Paula DeWitowitz, and I will be your guide. Chapter 2 highlights a number of different things, okay? It has a number of purposes. The first, of course, is to demonstrate that there is a gap in the literature about the topics that you're going to examine, what you're going to study in your own study. And it also shows us that you, as a researcher, have immersed yourself in the research enough to understand at an expert level what is already known. So the goal is really twofold for us to see in what you've done that, number one, you know enough about your topic to understand what the gap is, and also to understand how whatever you collect as data and analyze during your study fits into the larger body of knowledge so that you can really help to build on what is already known to expand our understanding of whatever your topic is. Now, to do that, you create saturation around your topic. So we're going to discuss saturation today, what it means and how to accomplish it. We're going to talk about concept mapping, both in quantitative and qualitative situations, about the quality of evidence that you should use in Chapter 2 and what is only appropriate for specific sections in Chapter 1, and about how you identify your framework. Then we're going to discuss a little bit synthesis, what that means, the process of synthesis and integration of the information that you acquire, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. As I mentioned, Chapter 2 is where you justify your study, okay? Now, to do that, you saturate the literature. You synthesize what is known. You demonstrate what is not known, which is going to be your research problem or your research gap. And then you explain the relevancy of each section of the literature, each part of the topic, or the related information about that topic that you need to really conduct a good quality study, how that fits with and is relevant to your study itself. So not just your topic, but also how it fits into your plan and what it means to the analysis of your data related to your topic. Why include that piece of information in your Chapter 2? Essentially, in the process of doing all of this, you will build an argument for the framework you're going to use in your study. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that framework means in just a minute. You're going to, in the process of doing all of this, explain your study's approach. Now, that really deals with the framework very closely, as well as how that framework helps us to examine the perspective and to understand the perspective that you're going to look at in your study. So you're going to review the relevance of the framework and the framework itself inside your Chapter 2. You're also going to create a critical synthesis and integration of research. Keeping in mind that I've just mentioned that, I want to help you understand a little bit more what that means. You're going to examine the strengths and weaknesses of the articles that you are reading from the literature. Now, this is all based not on new research that you're conducting, but on the research that you collect from the literature. So peer-reviewed journal sources. You're going to look at their strengths and weaknesses. You're going to consider the relative value, both in relation to your topic and to the integrity of their own studies. So in other words, you're going to look at the relevance of the population and the participants who were used to the study topic and to the results. You're going to consider the framework. Was it the best framework? How did it fit in? Why did they choose it? You're going to consider the methodology and the data sources. How appropriate are they? A little note here, often people could get a better quality data source if they had access to it. So there are a number of reasons why we don't always have access to the best quality data sources, which you may find as you develop your own dissertation study. But that is something to consider as you do your analysis of the literature in preparation for synthesis and integration into your Chapter 2. And the conclusions that are drawn, are they appropriate? Do they align with the study purpose? Do they make sense? You're also going to consider not just articles that support the perspective that you're taking or the questions that you want to ask, but articles that disagree with your perspective or approach or the topic that you want to consider. You're going to show that you've provided a balanced perspective, a balanced presentation, in order for us to know that you can conduct quality research. Because a cornerstone of quality research is using integrity, which means not presenting a biased argument. We want to be sure that when you come through a study, that you've conducted it and you've analyzed the data, that we can trust it to be accurate, honest reporting and not something that's biased in any way. Again, you're going to want to demonstrate mastery of the body of current knowledge on the topic. That's going to be integral as well. Now, it's important to understand that when you conduct a dissertation study or really write any academic piece, that what you're really doing is using scientific argumentation. You're not going to use persuasion. What does that mean? Essentially, you are not going to try to persuade through emotive or through judgment or through telling someone what they should think. Those are often common approaches that are used in other kinds of writing, but in academic or scholarly writing, we do not use that approach. So there will be no motives like, this is very interesting, this is extremely important, this is horrible, this is wonderful. Those kinds of emotives will not be there. Think of this as a straight, bland presentation of the information that's important, the information that's relevant in an objective way. There won't be judgments. This should be considered. This must be considered. This must be done. Teachers must. Parents must. Those kinds of things do not exist. So you could say, for example, it appears important to consider, okay, or it appears relevant to consider, but you can't say someone should or someone must do something. No judgments. Make sure that when you do this, you let the research literature dictate what you state. Don't try to force something to be said from the literature that's not there, because someone else picking up the same piece of literature could read it and realize that you might have stretched something. Now, I know that people would never do that on purpose, but you have to be careful because you can do it without realizing it. You can read into something what you want to see. Make sure that someone else, if they pick up that same article, is going to read the same thing from it that you did, so that you're not going to be accused later of being biased, okay? Clearly identify where the literature ends and your thought begins. This is extremely important. For example, let's say you're writing a paragraph and you're talking about parents' role in education, and you've read Jones, and Jones says that parents' role in education is extremely important. And notice I said the word extremely. You're not going to use that, but you could say, Jones indicates that parents' role in education is important. Now, he does not say, therefore, parents need to be involved in every part of the process, okay? You need to be sure that what you do is say, Jones indicated parents should be involved in every part of the process, okay, in education. Then you put your citation, you put your page number in parentheses, period, and you can say, it appears, therefore, that parents should be kept informed of every activity, or that it would be useful. It appears that it would be useful to have parents involved in every portion of the process, or something like that. Being careful not to use a judgment word at the same time. So my first example would be wrong, but it appears that it would be useful for parents to be involved. Note how I've conditionalized that, but I've also separated it from what was actually said, so that in the process you can see what you say, what the other person says. That becomes extremely important when you start to realize that what happens at times is if people misstate, it appears they have misquoted someone or misparaphrased someone, and that can impact their credibility. So be very careful to separate what you think or what you want to share of your ideas from what the authors say. Again, even if you disagree, you need to go with the evidence. You want to make sure that your presentation, and the evidence being what comes from peer-reviewed journal articles, you want to make sure that your presentation is unbiased, that your words are exacting so that you are not over or understating something, and that you are 100% accurate in what you share. Make sure there's no reason to indict your work later on when someone else reads the material that you've read. Side note here, it's also good to make sure that you're not quoting or citing, paraphrasing what someone else has paraphrased about someone. Okay, so let's say Smith wrote about Jones, Jeffries, and Daniels, okay? And he says that Jones, Jeffries, and Daniels all said that Super X games are fantastic and parents should let their children play Super X games all the time. You want to make sure that you cite that Jones cited these different people, okay? You don't want to make it sound like you thought that or that Jones thought that directly. You want to make sure that you always put credit where it belongs so that no one ever misunderstands what's being said. Okay. When you start to justify your study, as I mentioned, you're going to have to think in terms of saturation. Now, you do saturation essentially, or you accomplish that by developing first a concept or mind map about the relevant topics. You don't have to do this. It's not like it's a given. You must include this in your prospectus or your proposal. But it is important if you think in terms of really going into it with a logical plan so that you can accomplish things as quickly as possible. So when you develop a concept map, you're going to put down everything that is related to your topic that you think it is important for you to consider or to cover in order to really give a good presentation and make clear whatever it is related to your topic you need to for your study. What I would say about this is when you do it, don't be stingy, okay? If a topic does not have directly related literature, often people will tend to think they don't have to really have much of a literature review. Well, that's not true. All research is going to be based on some type of peer-reviewed research that's been conducted previously. So what you have to do is start mining ideas in order to understand what might be related, even if it's not directly related, so that you can base your research on something that has some peer-reviewed knowledge behind it. So let's say that you're looking at, for example, Program X, which is a totally new educational technology program, okay? And you want to see how it's working in a classroom. You could say, well, there's nothing out there on Project X, therefore I cannot research it, and I don't really have much of a literature review. Well, there are things out there on different kinds of projects, different kinds of programs, how they fit into the classroom, how they work, what different aspects of them are. And so you can go and research those kinds of things to see, number one, how teachers work with them, number two, how students work with them, number three, the different factors to consider in implementation, number four, and on, whatever is related to your topic, whichever part you're going to look at. Let's say just doing a descriptive study to find out what it looks like in the classroom. You might consider any or all of those kinds of things. Well, even if Project X has no knowledge out there about it in the peer-reviewed research literature, other projects do, or other programs do, and you start to dig into those pieces of information. Let's say that you're talking about something that's going to be used now in a high school classroom, but it's only ever been used in a third grade classroom. You would not say, okay, there's nothing out here in the high school category, so I have nothing relevant. You would say, okay, let me look at what's down here in third grade, and let me read that and share that information about this kind of program that's going to be now used in high school, and then say, well, I don't know if this will apply because it's a high school setting, but here are some things that we're seeing in third grade, so they can be considered here. Or same thing if you see it in a university setting. Okay, this is what happened at the university. That may be what happens at the high school setting. We'll have to wait and see. So you start to dig around to get other things that are related to it so that you can start to build some base of knowledge. Let's say it's something that takes your question, your gap takes 3 or 4 or 5 different topics and combines them. Then you might have information on those 3 or 4 or 5 topics, but nothing that covers all the aspects together. So you're looking, for example, at special needs students in inclusive classrooms mixed with gifted students who are working with reading at the third grade level, with students who are also English as a second language learners. So you've got a number of pieces being put together there. You would look for each of those separate pieces, cover those in your literature review, and then pull it all together at the end. So the trick with developing saturation is to be open to examining everything that you might need to examine. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to examine everything in the whole wide world. Talk to your committee, get a sense for what they think is important for you to include, but use your imagination, your creativity, and your knowledge about the different kinds of topics that can be related to start to do some planning so that you can do some really structured, most effective work as you're collecting your information from your literature review materials and building your literature review itself, okay? Here's an example of a concept map. There are numbers of them out there on the internet, and there are programs that you can purchase to develop your own as well if you want. I've got two in here, and I'm giving them to you really to give you an idea of what they could look like. But if you look inside here, in each of these boxes, and between the boxes on the arrows, they give you an idea of how you can structure a concept map if you've never done one. Your central concept goes up here in the concept map area, and then in each of these boxes, you see a hierarchical structure out. So your main thoughts could be related, or main topics related to your central phenomenon could be here, 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 and here. And as you build out, you subdivide. Let's say this topic is presidential elections. Here you might have Democrats, Republicans, or you might have just political party, voting stance, educational background, and personal values as your four main areas. Then under party, you might have Democrat, Republican, Independent, Libertarian, any number of things there that you would break out as well. So your central phenomenon, and your question could be how people choose voting, their presidential, who they vote for in the presidency. And this can be your breakout of what you need to consider. So that's how you could structure a concept map. Here's another example. Again, I chose it because it has all kinds of thoughts for you out through here in the circles so that you can think about it. I like this part that says messy, free-flowing, because that's what this really is. A concept map can be used kind of as a scratch paper for you as you're developing your literature review. So think of it as the place where you can write down all of the things that may be relevant, and then if you find information on something, you can put notes in, expand out the levels or layers that you have. If you find that there's nothing on something, you can make a note that that might be a potential gap. You might find that you drop whole sections because they're not going to be relevant to your study as you identify that the gap actually occurs over here on the left side of your concept map. You may not need some of the material over here on the right. Or you may get into your dissertation development after you've collected your data and find that there's something that you need to ultimately add because there's a whole new aspect that came out of your data, your data that you didn't realize you needed to think about or that you want to include. So this is something that's really just a messy kind of document to help you organize, but also to help you figure out what is useful along the way. So think of this as a living document. Also, I suggest you share it with your committee because they can give you input on what should and shouldn't be here. So remember that your committee is really in the process of helping you learn how to do this. You're going to show them through what you do that you are able to do a study, that you're able to use integrity, to use the rigor that you need to conduct a valid study using one method, not every method you could possibly use, but using one method well. So they're going to guide you, but they're not going to direct you. So if you develop your concept map, then you can go to them and ask them whether you think whether they think you've covered everything that you need to, or whether they would suggest you revisit and consider some more ideas. But they can help you with this process. Okay, one thing that a lot of people ask is, should I look at articles before I develop the concept map or after? Now, during your dissertation process, you will have already taken courses in your content area. So you will already have been reading articles to get an idea of what needs to go into your concept map. So in a way, this is a moot point. But the thing that I will say is that you need to set a standard of continually reading articles. So set yourself a standard perhaps of 2 articles a week or something like that that you're going to review, take notes on, that kind of thing. And if that helps you before you develop your concept map, then please feel free to do it. My guess is that you can already start developing some of it beforehand. And that as you continue to read literature focused on developing your literature review, that you will expand your concept map and actually make it more accurate for your purposes. More accurate for your purposes, meaning that it's not going to be the right version, the right answer. There isn't going to be one. It's going to be what works best for you and what covers the material you need. So that said, you will continue to expand it. So before and after, it can be useful. You will need to have familiarity before, and you will need to keep expanding it as you go. The other thing that I will say is, as you're starting to build this and as you're starting to conduct your literature review, kind of like a side note, is that if you read the abstracts for the articles, you can get an idea of how they might fit into your topic and see whether or not they're relevant. Okay, so as you consider what you want to put into your concept map and then later what you want to include in your own personal library of articles that you've read for your literature review, you want to consider reading the abstract, and that can save you a lot of time. When you have read the abstracts and they sound like they're important to you, then go ahead and read the articles. If in doubt, you can always go to the findings and results sections and read those and see how that information can contribute to your understanding of whether that article is valuable. Quality of evidence is extremely important to understand. Notice that I just used an emotive word, extremely, which you would not use in your writing, but it is extremely important for you to understand how the quality of evidence plays into what you do when you pull together your literature review. So I've put some arbitrary kinds of values on here, gold being, of course, in this system that I've created, the most valuable. Gold documents are articles reporting research in peer-reviewed journals. Peer-reviewed journals are journals where there are usually 2 to 3 reviewers who do not know the identity of the author, who read the article to determine whether or not it's of high enough quality to be included in the journal itself. So number 1, is the topic relevant? And number 2, how is the study conducted? Is it conducted with rigor? Does everything align? Does it make sense? Are the conclusions appropriate based on what's been presented? So those are the most important resources you can use. Why? Because you can do your own evaluation of what's missing, what's misrepresented, of what may not fit, of what's not aligned, of whether the data sources were the best, if the method was actually going to answer the questions that were being asked, to see whether the conclusions fit. You get to do your own evaluation as well and your own assessment. Don't be critical as in everything is going to be bad, but be critical as in I'm going to be a critical consumer of information, because not everything that gets into a peer-reviewed journal is always the best quality work. So just keep that in mind. And articles reporting research give you the chance to do that kind of analysis for yourself. Silver level articles and materials are not quite as good. Those are going to be articles reporting perspective. Now that's where someone often will pull together a number of different articles discussing research and present an idea or a perspective coming from how they presented that information. A couple of things make those less valuable. Number 1, even if it's in a peer-reviewed journal, it is a perspective. So not necessarily an unbiased presentation has been given to you. The presentation could be biased. You would have to go to every single article they discuss in order to know that. So that makes it a little bit weaker. Also, there's no discussion there of the kinds of methodologies necessarily or the kinds of data sources. It's really just the conclusions that are drawn that are most often talked about. So again, you can't do that kind of analysis. You have to trust the author, and that's not always a very good thing to do. Dissertations are included in that group, not because they're not good quality work, but because when we serve on a committee, as your committee, we want you to succeed. We know who you are, and we are a biased group, okay? So we're here to help you succeed, and we are not going to give you an unbiased presentation the way that a peer-reviewed journal would of the quality of your work. So dissertations are included here. There is an exception in some situations, and you need to talk to your chair, your content member about this, because some specializations are so quick moving that dissertations are often the most useful resources. So check with your committee to see about that, but these are not considered the highest quality resources and should not be the bulk of your research presented in your chapter 2. Peer-reviewed edited books are a similar kind of situation in that peer-reviewed edited books take longer to get out. So unlike a peer-reviewed article that talks about a research piece, which can be turned out fairly quickly and published probably within a year of the period of time in which the study's been completed, a peer-reviewed edited book could take considerably longer because the edited books require every single person who is providing information or providing a section to complete their work for that to be edited. They have to be advertised for first before any of that can occur, and that can be a 6-month process at times. And then all of the pieces have to be fitted in at the end, and then peer reviewing has to occur after that. So there's a huge period of time, often 3 years, that can pass. So it's not considered a high quality piece. Plus, they're not going to be talking about their research, they're going to be talking about perspectives. So again, not the best quality work for your literature review. Now, bronze books are the least strong quality materials that you should see in a literature review, and they should be almost non-existent if they're there at all. Those are books by experts presenting what they as experts have learned. The reason that they're not as valuable is that often these are seminal works, and unlike what people can assume because the word seminal is in there, it does not mean that that's the last word on the topic. What it means is that a theory has been developed from whatever that final work is, or that that final work presents a theory. But as we know as consumers of a scholarly work, that only means that people take that theory and then begin to build on it, which means more research has been done, or they tend to challenge it, or they tend to consider how its permutations might apply in different situations. So there's always work building on those bronze types of books by experts that some of which might even qualify as silver level work, and some of which will be gold level work. So those bronze sources are not very good quality for literature review that's supposed to be talking about saturation on a topic. The final level is copper, and this really only belongs in chapter 1, where you're talking in your introduction about the nature of a social problem to kind of set the context for whatever your research gap or your research problem is going to be. Those are things like newspaper articles that might give you statistics or might give you people's impressions or opinions on something. Those are opinion pieces that might be presented, consumer pieces that might be generated by things like the ASCD, which is focused on, it's an association focused on supervision and curriculum development. Policy information coming out of the government, things like that might be put into chapter 1 that talks about the social problem in the introduction. So those do not belong anywhere in chapter 2 or in the literature review. Saturation, and I have several different quotes here to kind of give you different perspectives, but they all say basically the same thing. Saturation is the idea that you're going to cover all of the literature required to discuss every new or noteworthy concept in relation to your topic, in relation to the phenomenon you're examining. Now, does that mean you're going to cover every single article? No, it doesn't. But you're going to cover a chunk of them, okay? The most effective method that you can accomplish this by doing is to search the references of the articles that were retrieved to determine which of them seem relevant, find those, read their references, and repeat the process until saturation is reached, okay? Where no new relevant articles come to light. Now, this was written by Justice Randolph, and he's not far off, except for one problem. This is focusing backward, okay? Read the references to the articles that you just read. That takes you backward in terms of saturation. But what about moving forward? Because remember that saturation needs to occur not just in the old literature, but also in the new literature. You really want to show that within the last 5 years, no one has answered the question that you're going to ask, okay? So if you're only going backward, if you're only looking backward, how can you accomplish that? Here are some suggestions. Identify all the articles that you can that are available using your concept map. Now, when you create that concept map, you can, as you identify articles that fit under one or the other of those concepts, identify what the keywords that are used in those articles are. Create a list of those keywords and start searching on those to find out more current articles on those same topics. You can have your committee review the concept map to ensure that you've included the variables or the factors that you need, or that they can point you in a direction to find them if you don't have them yet. You can watch out for multiple keywords referring to the same thing. Remember that if you shift from, for example, from psychology to education, to sociology, to history, you may be talking about the same phenomenon from different perspectives, but they'll have different words attached. Okay, everyone uses a little bit different language for whatever reason for the same thing. So you need to be aware of that. And if you are shifting, for example, from psychology to education, which could easily happen, or from any other of the social sciences to education or psychology or human services or anything like that, then you need to be aware of those differences in words and list the multiple keywords so that you can do searches appropriately and not miss material. Again, you want to review the article abstracts to identify if the articles actually fit your topic, and if they do, then think about using those keywords and doing a search until you've saturated, until you have no new ideas coming up. Again, not to be repetitive, but as you do all of this, create a master list of keywords and topics for yourself. So perhaps you don't have space on the concept map itself. Perhaps you have to have a separate file where you put these keywords. Then do that. It's really nice to be able to create Excel files of these. Also realize that there can be combinations of keywords that can give you different articles. So you may not want to do a search on just one keyword, then one keyword, then one keyword. You want to use combinations to try to pull up different kinds of articles. As you do this, keeping a list of the article combinations or the keyword combinations you've used can make a huge difference so that you don't go back and research something that you've already searched once. So creating a master list can be very useful for you. Expanding your search parameters as appropriate will be really important. Okay, that is something to really be careful of. Remember that this is a living document. I've included this last quotation here from Patterson from the Writing Center for a specific reason. Again, I want to highlight that dissertations and theses are not considered documents appropriate for literature reviews because they're not considered peer-reviewed. Keeping in mind, as I said, that there are topics that just do not have the research out there. There isn't enough time for research to be built up, and it's very possible that the only thing available is dissertations to cover some pieces of information. Again, go with what your committee tells you because they're going to be your experts. As you do all of this, like there isn't enough already for you to do as you're doing this, remember to read, annotate, evaluate the articles as you go through so that you are aware of the quality of the articles and whether you've gotten what you need. Your goal is to make sure that you reach a point where there are no new ideas being presented. Again, you're going to want to make sure you read both the older articles, including seminal works, so that you can understand what's gone before and understand the context for the current work, the work within the last 5 years. But you want to make sure in the last 5 years, the gap is still a gap. So you want those two aspects. Something else important to understand about older work. Often, answers will be provided in previous research. In other words, something may be researched out and they don't talk about it anymore. As I mentioned, seminal works and those expert books often present theories that are then built on afterward. So they won't necessarily talk about that seminal theory anymore. They'll start to divide the newer topics, the offshoots, and discuss them separately. And you may not realize, if you haven't saturated in the older works, that gap has already been filled. In some situations, the gap will have changed a little bit, or there's a potential that the gap could have been recreated because time has changed something, some variable. But keep in mind that when it comes to education and learning, that often those gaps really don't represent themselves. We know how students learn certain things. We know how certain things are useful being taught. So you need to be careful that you have that older material so that you know whether you actually have a legitimate gap or not. An annotation includes a number of pieces of information. You will have done this probably in some of your classes, since annotations are something that often are built in classes. They include the educational problem or the social problem, the research problem, purpose, framework, methodology used in the study, population or sample, the number of participants, the type of participants, the data sources that were collected, analysis notes, and conclusions. All of those sections should be discussed by you in the notes that you take, whether you take it in the annotation form in a series of paragraphs, or whether you use an Excel form, something like a literature review matrix that might be useful. Okay, in either form, you want to take those notes as you read the article the first time, because that saves you having to go back and reread it multiple times. Okay, when you get those annotations done, it becomes easier for you to synthesize and integrate the information that the authors present, that the researchers have concluded as a result of the study that they're presenting in their materials. So you want to take the annotations as part of the note-taking process and be critical about the articles, constructively critical, as you take those notes. When you get to the point where you can actually start to compare and contrast the contents of the articles, the population, the setting, the timing, the methods, the strengths and weaknesses of the articles, then you are ready to start synthesizing material. So you need to be able to give yourself a chance to be realistic and comprehensive as you conduct this data collection from the articles, article analysis is probably a better way to put it, and put that information into the annotations so that you can do good quality synthesis on the other end. So synthesis itself is actually pulling similar details together, okay, so that you can expand on the conclusions that can be drawn based on what different researchers have presented in terms of their information. And I'll give you an example in just a minute. Integration is really the opposite process. So you have different details, different conclusions, and what you try to do is reconcile how those different conclusions can all occur without creating conflict, okay, without creating discord. When you can't do that, then you have a potential research gap, because you need to find out why you have those two different responses that cannot be reconciled. Now, you don't have to pick up that gap, but that is a potential gap there. So synthesis is similar ideas, integration is different ideas that you try to reconcile. What you're doing when you synthesize is take what is known and see how those pieces of what is known can fit together. So let me give you an example. 3 different articles present this information. All written by Smith in 1991, 92, and 93. Okay, very old, would not be current for us, but let me just use this to give you an idea. Students learn best in classrooms where there is order. Students learn best in classrooms where there is quiet. And students learn best in classrooms where there is respect. Notice how these three things do not contradict each other. They're not in conflict. You can have order, quiet, and respect in the same classroom without a problem. So I would synthesize those three ideas. Research indicates that students learn best in classrooms that are ordered, where the environment is quiet and respectful of everyone. I would put a citation or citations after that. Smith, 1991, 92, 93, whatever those years were. And that would be my presentation. Now, it's important to realize, too, that these would have to be similar students. Okay, so I'd have to give some kind of context for that if it's not already there. But this gives you a general idea of what a synthesis would look like. In contrast, an integration is really talking about situations where you don't have that kind of commonality, where you don't have that kind of congruence. So an example would be students learn well in quiet classrooms. Students learn well when allowed to work together. Students learn well when they interact with each other on projects, and students learn well when they give presentations. Notice how quiet classrooms really contradict the idea of working together, interacting with each other on projects, or giving presentations. So how do you integrate something like this? Well, you dig a little deeper. You look for the further detail related to it. So we see that students learn well in quiet classrooms when they're talking about study halls. This is where the study was conducted. Second study looking at study halls found that students learn well when allowed to work together. A third study looked at social studies classrooms where they interact well with each other on projects. And fourth, where they were in English language arts classrooms where they learn well when giving presentations. So what does this mean? Well, we know that the information on study halls is conflicting. So there is conflicting evidence regarding strong methods for students to learn in study halls, including working quietly and working with others. That's how you have to present it. You don't have a good solution to that. There's no way to account for that difference. But students benefit from interacting with each other on projects in social studies classes and from giving presentations in English language arts classes. Notice how those two things can be reconciled because they're not the same environment with conflicting results. So you can present it in this way, however research indicates, and explain that. Put the citations with the material, and that's a simple integration. Okay, so that's a part of what you want to do as you're talking about these articles and talking about your topics. At the end of each of these sections, because each topic that you cover in relation to your phenomenon will have a different section in your literature review, where you will discuss a number of articles related to it, you want to clarify what you've told us. So what is the point of the information that you've shared? Okay, how is this clear? What does this mean? And then how does it relate to your study? So there may be 75 topics you can cover in relation to your phenomenon, in relation to what you're considering, but only 15 of them might be useful to your study. You're only going to cover those 15 areas. This is where you're going to work with your committee. You're going to create your concept map and you're going to say, okay, here are all the things that are related. Now, what do I really need to cover? And you're going to start to dig into the literature and make that kind of decision in conjunction with your committee so that they can help you to understand how to really be clear on that process and not spin your wheels. And at the end of each of these sections, you're going to clarify why that is important to your topic. Let's say it's going to help you to understand the data that you collect. It's going to help you to understand the nature of the phenomenon. It tells you what the gap is. It explains what is not the gap. Those kinds of pieces of information are what you'll provide at the end. Your framework is going to come out of your literature review. So it's going to be what you identify as being most important to how you structure a study. Now, if it's a quantitative study, it's going to be something that you're going to test. It could be a theory, it could be a hypothesis that someone else has presented, it could be a hypothesis that you developed based on some of the previous research, but it's going to build out of your study. If it's a conceptual framework, it's going to be something that you identify in relation to the approach you want to take. 3 or 4 pieces of current research that fit together to help you explain how you're going to approach your study, what your perspective is going to be, that kind of thing. You're going to build it from what gets repeated often in articles related to your topic that seem relevant or that seem similar to what you're considering looking at. So you're going to evolve that framework and you're going to discuss it in your literature review, but it's going to be based on what you find as you conduct your own literature review of material, okay? You're going to make sure that as you do this, you both confirm and disconfirm whatever is related to your framework and to your other literature. That sounds really confusing in a way, but essentially we want to make sure, again, that you're not presenting something in a biased manner. So if there's information related to your topic or your framework, you want to give us a clear picture, a complete picture of what that means, okay? Your framework can include both seminal works and theories, or it can include updates on seminal works, okay? Again, theoretical, testing a theory or hypothesis. Conceptual, giving us a perspective or an approach. Conceptual frameworks are normally used both for qualitative work and for mixed method studies, okay? Again, you want to make sure that you don't use emotive words, that you don't state absolutes. You definitively will not state absolutes. How's that? I've just given you an absolute for that. But you're going to make sure you don't mix your thoughts with the thoughts of the authors that you've read or the researchers. They need to be easily identified as separate. Something else that is often not shared but that is very important is that you want to make sure that you do not quote unless it is absolutely necessary, because 10% quotation is considered de facto plagiarism. You've used too many of someone else's words. So please get comfortable with the idea of paraphrasing. Think about how you can rephrase something. If you need assistance with that, reach out. There are materials available to help you with it. But these are some do nots and some things to keep in mind. Beyond the proposal, you're going to want to continue with saturation. You want to make sure that if something comes out while you are actually collecting your data or writing up your study, that you include that. You go back to chapter 2 and include it, and then you consider it for chapter 5. Because you want to make sure that when you finish your dissertation, you have the strongest presentation possible. And that means including the most up-to-date information. So your final dissertation should include a saturation of current research at the time the final version is approved. And that ends this slideshow. I hope this has been helpful. Please reach out if I can be of any more assistance. Again, my name is Paula DeWitowitz, and I am the research coordinator for the PhD education program at Walden University in the School of Education and Professional Licensure. Thank you very much.